Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete, back with another episode on Swole Radio. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Eric Helms, who is a WNBF pro natural bodybuilder and a huge inspiration in the field. I was just reading comments on our last interview and someone commented, "So this is what it's like to have a dad." That's just an example of how much of a mentor Eric is in this field. So today we're going to be getting into some advanced discussion about fat loss. Thanks for being on the show, Eric.
No worries. I'm happy to do it. And man, that is quite a bit of responsibility. And I feel bad that I've never played catch with that person, nor have we talked about, financial security. And they basically are just learning about how to interpret research on fat loss.
It's okay. They're jacked. That's all that matters. So we're going to be getting into some more nuanced topics. Last time, a few episodes ago, we were getting into the broad strokes of calories and macros. We're going to be drilling in a little deeper today. First question is, we're going to start off with some of the more food quality type questions. This is a classic question where people ask, does eating clean matter for fat loss?
Yeah, I think there's the thermodynamics answer, and then there's the practical reality answer. From a thermodynamics perspective, if you were a robot, so long as you achieved the same rough macronutrient, micronutrient, fiber, and energy intake, and the same energy outputs, you have the same energy balance, you would get equivalent fat loss regardless of what types of foods you ate to get there, especially in the short term. There is more to the food matrix than just micronutrients, fiber, and macros, but like if we're talking about a 12-week fat loss phase. But the reality is that changes in our body composition are not simply a function of thermodynamics. They're a function of our behaviors that result in the thermodynamics that we're trying to get to. And a lot of the foods that we associate with being quote unquote clean, which I think is not a useful paradigm, but I know what people mean when they say that, tend to be better for satiety and energy regulation, and result in the process of getting into a deficit occurring with less stress, effort, and lower hunger levels. So, for example, there was a great study conducted by Kevin Hall that was done in a metabolic ward where they compared ultra-processed diets to largely whole food diets in an ad libitum model, meaning that the individuals can eat whatever they wanted. So they had these folks come in a metabolic ward where they can perfectly measure energy expenditure, and they can also use high-quality metabolic, testing to assess changes in energy expenditure, and then perfectly control energy intake because they're being made in a metabolic ward. And then they look at high-quality changes in body composition. And this was not one of those controlled trials where they matched energy intake and they tried to make sure everyone ate the same amount. They said, hey, here's the foods that fit these kind of diet archetypes. We've tried to match them for macronutrient intake, energy density, and a few other things, but you can't do that perfectly because some of those things are just different when you compare ultra-processed foods with whole foods. And they saw what happened. And the people who followed the ultra-processed diet found themselves on average in a 500-calorie surplus. And the people who were eating the single ingredient food item, mostly whole food diet, found themselves in roughly a 500-calorie deficit. And there was spontaneous weight gain in one group, spontaneous weight loss in the other. And you saw basically ratings of ease of eating. So the food was consumed faster and the mouthfeel was easier in the processed group. And it was consumed slower in the whole foods group. And that's just one of the many components. But when we look at what are quote unquote clean foods and what are quote unquote dirty foods, they kind of map onto what we would consider processed versus whole foods. But the issue is that there's very little consensus on what is quote unquote clean or dirty. And obviously those are like puritanical words that have morality attached to them, which I think can be harmful psychologically. I think a much better way of viewing this is which foods are going to make my diet more balanced, give me the micronutrition support and the sustained energy and appetite control that are going to be helpful for my goals, and which ones are not. And the answer is not to just rigidly and strictly ban all the foods that are not, because that also from what we see in psychology research and the behavior of eating, is a problem. As soon as you are rigidly restrained, you tend to have a greater incidence of regaining weight, not being able to successfully lose weight, and a higher incidence of disordered eating and body image concerns. So the trick is to not ban these foods, but to make the majority of your diet come from minimally processed whole foods. So fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, varied fat sources, and then still have the permission to include foods that might not be traditionally seen as clean in a bodybuilding context, but just make sure they're not taking up the majority of your diet. And that's relatively easy to do. You can hit, if you were to kind of think of what we call the default diet at 3DMJ, like what's my kind of bare minimum dietary structure of a lean protein, fruits and vegetables, and just trace fats, that's probably only going to consist of maybe a half to 2/3 of your caloric intake for the day. And then you can sprinkle in stuff on top of that once you've hit your kind of vegetable and fruit and fiber and protein needs and gotten all those other great things, plant sterols, phytonutrients that exist in the food matrix of these whole foods. And then you can not feel like you're handcuffed to not being allowed to have like a skinny cow after dinner or something like that or whatever.
And then along a related note, fiber is another topic. Is that something that you would, that you talk about with your athletes?
Yeah, it is. We generally have fiber guidelines that kind of go hand in hand with our fruit and vegetable guidelines. So a useful way of kind of trying to get here, like if you look at some of the meta-analyses, you get benefits up to consuming like I think 400 or 500 grams of like plants, including fruits and vegetables per day. And that roughly means like 2 to 3 servings per day a piece of fruits and vegetables. And those are like useful things to include into a diet because they do have a very low energy density. Mm-hmm. So what is energy density? People aren't familiar. It's basically how much does the food weigh compared to how many calories are in it. So a bowl of broccoli might weigh the same amount as a bowl of fries, but the bowl of fries has 10 times as many calories as that bowl of broccoli. And satiety is a very complex process in the body, getting satiated and deciding to stop eating. A lot goes into it. Part of it, though, is the actual amount of food you've eaten, how long you've been eating, the time it takes to consume it, and then how much actual stretch there is in the stomach, how much space does it take up. So low energy density foods tend to promote more satiety, but there's also influence of how many calories you've consumed, what the macronutrient content is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The flavor profile, there's a lot that goes into satiety. However, generally, if you reduce the energy density of a diet, people tend to eat less. So fruits and vegetables are very low energy density foods, and they also contain fiber. And fiber also tends to promote satiety. It slows down gastric emptying. It does take up room in the gut, but it is, depending upon the type of fiber and the source, a small number of calories. And it tends to result in better blood glucose management as well. So you tend to have a little bit better energy levels. So yeah, fiber is important. I think a general recommendation is you probably want to fall between 20 to 30 grams. Some people will do better with higher intake. Some people, more than that will be too much. And it should scale with calorie intake. I think 20 grams being like a minimum, and then 30, maybe 40 grams for someone with a very high calorie intake, which should be somewhere roughly a maximum. And if you're achieving that 2 to 3 servings a piece of fruits and vegetables, you're going to get them almost always the majority of that fiber in addition to whatever your carb sources are and just incidental intake for the rest of the day. So yeah, those are important components of the diet as well.
Mm-hmm. Does more fiber help, like, going beyond that initial targeted amount if someone is trying to curb their satiety?
Probably not. And it can actually cause issues. You can get a sense of bloating. It can give you more gas. It really depends on the type of fiber. There's many different classifications, and so like you can derive from like insoluble fiber, which is probably not the classification used anymore. There's been some changes in the dietary recommendations and the classifications, but the fiber you get that doesn't bulk up like oatmeal, it doesn't absorb a ton of water, but just kind of is generally indigestible in your stomach, it actually does get fermented, and you can generate short chain fatty acids from it in your long intestine. So it is like bacteria fuel, if you will. And the consumption of that and the creation of those short chain fatty acids does generally produce gas, which can produce bloating and stinky farts. So, if you eat a ton of cauliflower rice or a bowl of broccoli or a bunch of cabbage, people generally experience the, higher levels of gas. Eat a bunch of beans. Like, there's a reason why a lot of the foods that we associate with being a little more bloated or gassy tend to be high in fiber and certain types of fiber. And going too high in fiber can impact nutrient absorption, can slow down digestion to the point where it's akin to constipation. It can be just generally uncomfortable. So there is a sweet spot. You don't want to be too low, but you also don't want to be too high. And it's quite individual. And it's the type of thing where if you are struggling with that and you're in the range of 20 to 30, the answer might be to be lower or to be higher or to change your food sources. So there's no clear cut answer for that. And I would generally recommend someone talk to like a registered dietitian if they are in the kind of normative ranges and they're struggling there. But another thing to consider is that during the course of fat loss, especially if it's a fair amount of fat loss, or if it's an extended period of time, or you're getting very lean, one of the components of low energy availability and one of the symptoms of red S, so relative energy deficiency in sport, is gastrointestinal distress to some degree. And it's pretty normal for, like, if you talk to competitors at a certain stage in prep, their bowel movement frequency goes down. It's a little weird. It's uncomfortable. And they spend way too much time talking about it just because it differs, and it's not fun. Like they wish they could poop more easily and that the process was not as protracted. And, they feel randomly bloated and it kind of messes with their appearance and their head, scale weight. So, yeah, I think depending upon what type of fat loss phase you're after, you should expect some degree of irregularity. If you're using a refeed-based approach, you will typically notice on those days when energy availability is restored and carbohydrate intake is higher, and fat intake is higher generally too, to some degree, that those are days when things seem to move a little better. And then you can kind of get an indication of, okay, maybe if I didn't alter my diet that much for a refeed day, I basically just took the same diet skeleton, but added in some more carbs. Okay, it wasn't an issue of being too low in fiber. That's not why I'm having these issues, or too high in fiber, right? It's just an issue of being too low in calories and dieting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like what you said, and particularly about people having to find that sweet spot for themselves, where it's not a magic formula where people just be like, yeah, just replace everything with broccoli and you're going to be good to go. Not going to be fun. So, okay. Another major topic I wanted to break into was nutrient timing. This is something where it's a lot of fun to bodybuilders love to talk about as you get more nuanced. What are your thoughts on carb distribution in fat loss?
It's largely a way of trying to maintain steady energy levels, good performance in the gym and when you're doing cardio, and a diet adherence tool. As far as the actual physiology of fat loss, it's going to ultimately come down to total balance of energy and nutrients. So whether you distribute them early in the day or later in the day, not going to make a huge difference. I do think it probably makes a little more sense to be a little more AM skewed for most people, because you are just coming out of a longer period of fasting. You're going to start your day. You're going to be burning more calories. You're going to need to get through life generally. And whether you train earlier in the day or later, it's not going to be heavily dependent upon the acute carbohydrate intake right before, maybe a little bit. But most people do better with a kind of a descending energy intake overall, which is going to scale with carbohydrates as well. So bigger breakfasts, moderate sized lunches, more like a kind of like a salad for dinner. And that's kind of like that general distribution, right? That tends to do better with adherence. And also it gives you more ability to auto-regulate throughout the day. So if you're eating a very, very small breakfast and then biasing meals later in the day, when people get normally hungry at night anyway, it's very difficult because you're going to probably feel worse because you're spending most of the day in a low calorie balance, right? So it can make you feel the deficit more for a longer part of the day and be like, oh yeah, I should have more food. Like I feel pretty run down. But on the other hand, if you have a relatively large breakfast and you're feeling great for the whole day and you're not that hungry for lunch, you can cut back a bit of lunch. And then you can do the same thing at dinner. And you can get a better gauge of, when do I actually need a certain amount of energy to feel appropriately hungry or lethargic given the phase of my diet and my rate of weight loss. And on average, not everyone, your mileage may vary, seems to do better when they are not like saving calories for big dinners. I haven't seen that reliably improve sleep in most people, even though I've tried it and I've had clients try it. It seems to be more of a kind of systemic energy balance issue. I think the main thing is just making sure that you also have a little bit of carbohydrate going into your training. That doesn't always matter in the off season, but it more consistently seems to have a subjective impact in the in season. We did a meta-analysis led by my PhD student, Andrew King. And one of the things we found is that the longer period of fasting you had, the more likely it would be that a pre-workout feeding of carbohydrates would result in higher volume performed in the session. So if you think about what time of the day do you train, when are you fasting, and not that eating less carbohydrates is the same thing as fasting, but if you're going relatively hungry into a workout, data would suggest that can negatively impact performance more often than not. The dose isn't especially important based upon the research we have, but just more so the presence. There are receptors for carbohydrates in the mouth and the gut, and there may be some kind of brain-gut link or satiety-based influence on your ability to perform well in the gym, especially on leg days. That's more consistently observed on lower body workouts in the research, and more anecdotally, people find their run down and their performance drops off if they're 45 minutes into a hard leg day during prep. So I think the distribution for carbohydrates, generally I recommend biasing it to earlier in the day and then having some amount before in the meal before you train, which you probably don't want to be huge if it's close to when you train. And if it's a larger meal, you probably want to give yourself a couple hours to digest. But I find most people 1 to 2 hours prior to training finishing that meal, with smaller meals being better if it's closer to the time, or if it's an upper body workout, probably doesn't matter as much. But if you've got like a relatively decent sized meal that you're going to eat before your leg day, then give yourself a couple hours to digest.
Yeah, that's fascinating about the, what you said about the amount necessarily doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot, where people think a lot. I think often people blow, bodybuilding training out of proportion a bit in terms of the overall actual requirement in terms of glycogen or carbohydrates on the grand scheme of athletics, right? Compared to say you're a triathlete or marathoner. But I do find that, having something when you're deep in prep, can make a big difference.
Also, even more importantly, is that even if bodybuilding training really did have a big energy suck in demand, you're not going to be able to do much about that 1 to 2 hours prior. If you look at the time course of, say, glycogen replenishment and the nature of bodybuilding training, even though it's far less intermittent than, say, powerlifting training, you're still spending most of your time in the gym as a bodybuilder probably resting. Like even me, where I do antagonist paired sets for almost everything, and then my isolation movements are, drop sets or rest pause. You still do rest with antagonist paired sets. I'll do a set of chest, a set of back, and then I'll rest a couple minutes. The set of chest takes 20 to 40 seconds, set of back, 20 to 40 seconds, but then I rest 2 to 3 minutes, So it's like, it's still a more rest than not, ultimately. So that is something that is just not the same as where you see a cycling study, where it's continuous exercise, where they're benefiting from intra-workout carbohydrate. And there's also a pretty high sweat rate, loss of electrolytes. So yeah, when you look at another way to look at why the dose itself might not matter, and there's interesting research on this, on carbohydrate mouth rinsing, where more consistently during endurance exercise, and sometimes, but not always, during resistance training, you can see that just simply swishing your mouth with like Gatorade and then spitting it out, so not actually consuming any carbohydrates, is enough to bring performance back up or have a meaningful impact on performance. And that's basically, again, those carbohydrate sensors in the mouth going, oh, okay, maybe we have access to this, so I shouldn't govern or pull back on the effort we can put forth centrally. So I think that's quite interesting. And in that same meta-analysis, we had some meta-regressions and we had some like categorical comparisons. And we did see, again, longer fasting period, more likely to benefit from pre-workout carbohydrate in terms of volume performed. The interesting part was that we had a meta-regression showing more volume performed in the workout, more likely to benefit from having carbohydrates pre-workout for volume performed. However, when we did a meta-regression on the dose, no relationship. So again, it is just the presence of it being there, which kind of aligns with the carbohydrate mouth rinsing that is probably important if you've got a relatively, large energy output workout that you have to do, high amount of volume, and kind of in parallel with that longer fasting period. If you're in a diet, you're always in a semi-fasted state because these meals are not super satiating or satisfying. So yeah, I think ultimately what you don't want to do is go into your session super hungry, but also acknowledging that you may be super hungry at some point no matter what. So don't try to be like, well, I'm going to eat a massive bowl of mushrooms and save 80% of my calories before I go train, because you're just going to feel like crap in your training session.
Yeah, I actually find that for me in prep, training is the time when it actually alleviates my hunger, where I'll just have enough in my pre-workout meal so that I'm not actively hungry starting out, but it usually helps in that regard. And then in terms of post-workout nutrition, any considerations?
Not really. I would say it's a good opportunity to get in protein, and we could shift to a discussion on nutrient timing related to protein, but it's not as much of an optimal time to consume nutrients as we used to think. The realities of protein research as we've come to see them now are that you actually can consume very high doses of protein and not, quote unquote, miss out on some of it getting oxidized or not being efficiently used. There's a recent paper that came out by Tromelin where they actually looked at 10 hours, which is a longer time period than most acute protein research. So historically, people would emphasize the post-workout period for both carbohydrates and protein based upon mostly endurance workout, showing that if you were to do a hard endurance training session, you get pretty substantial depletion of glycogen, and then you would get preferential and accelerated replenishment of glycogen by having carbohydrate immediately afterwards. But when you look at the actual time course of how much this matters, the degree of glycogen depletion you get from resistance training, and then how bodybuilders train and when they're going to train those muscle groups again, it doesn't really seem to be an issue unless you're doing like multi-stage same day endurance training events, or maybe like a long endurance day, like 2 days in a row. And you can still get pretty damn good glycogen replenishment, even on a diet, eating a moderate carbohydrate amount by the time you come to train a muscle group again in most cases, or even just by the next day. So yeah, and there is, I mean, you will see, if you're carbohydrate restricted, some, performance decrements, and some in the majority of research, it's either neutral or negative when you're on ketogenic diets, especially during a deficit in resistance training studies. But the effect is not nearly as pronounced as you'd expect it to be. And more importantly, the impact of that on actual bodybuilding outcomes is unclear. So do you need to show that, like, with a really super high volume, resistance training performance, that there's some small deficit or some small decrement of being on a low carbohydrate diet? Does that really map onto, oh, we need to have carbohydrates post-workout while dieting? Not really. It's probably an issue of total carbohydrate intake, energy intake, and volume performed, and trying to find the right match there in your frequency and how you distribute your work throughout the week. If this was continuous exercise, maybe a different story. But ultimately, glycogen replenishment, not really a concern, nor something that you can fully fix on the diet anyway, because you need to be a little bit carbohydrate depleted to be losing fat because you're in an energy deficit. And the second reason sometimes it is promoted to have carbohydrates post-workout is because of the insulin spike, a mechanistic rationale of the anti-catabolic effect of a rise in insulin combined with a rise in muscle protein synthesis from the leucine bolus. You'll hear this argument of that's the double whammy of anti-catabolic, catabolic, or anabolic and anti-catabolic at the same time. But when we actually look at the research on outcomes, that has just not been consistently shown. So long as you are getting a decent distribution of protein throughout the day, a total sufficient amount of good enough protein, your energy balance isn't too low, doesn't really seem to impact anything, like your carbohydrate content doesn't really seem to impact actual outcomes. Those mechanistic things don't really play out. And the relevance of insulin as a anti-catabolic or anabolic hormone within normal physiological ranges is not very strong. It's not the same thing as, a bodybuilder in the IFBB who is actually taking insulin post-workout, as an example, which is some of where those kind of perpetuated ideas came from.
Okay, yeah. So basically, to the extent at which we're able to manipulate insulin at a natural level doesn't really matter.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then in terms of protein timing, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so going back to that study by Tromelin and colleagues, where they looked at 10 hours, which is relatively long for these acute feeding boluses, and they gave 100 grams of protein. They actually found that there wasn't a point where it was a very obvious drop-off and it was just being oxidized for energy and not being incorporated. What happens when you eat higher boluses of protein is the digestion time course slows down. And if we follow the line of thinking of, okay, why might we want to take in these boluses of protein and have this protein distribution, it's all based upon studies where we're looking at fast digesting whey in a fasted state for a short period of time. And we can see that, it's better looking at MPS, not actually hypertrophy, that if we get these even moderate bolus doses spread out, we can get the most area under the curve, again, in like a 6 to 8 hour period at most, for muscle protein synthesis. And we're assuming that will translate to long-term increases in hypertrophy. Now, the reason why it works that way is because of the study conditions. And that's what Tromelin basically showed in his recent study, is that, okay, protein has to get digested for there to be amino acids, which then have to get shuttled into the blood to get a rise in essential amino acids and leucine in the blood, for that to again to get delivered to the muscle, for then muscle protein synthesis to go up, right? And there can only be so much of that in any given one time. So therefore, you should only eat 30 grams of protein at a time. Well, not really, because if you eat more than that, digestion time course takes longer. So the amino acids get released at a slower pace into your bloodstream, and therefore they get delivered to your muscles at a slower pace, and it rises and sustains that rise for a longer time period in a delayed time period. So what they saw when they were comparing this 100-gram bolus to a moderate bolus is that the net outcome was actually higher muscle protein synthesis in the 100-gram dose because it was more total protein. And essentially, your stomach just kind of, or I should say your digestive tract, just acts as a reservoir of amino acids that are getting titrated at a slower rate, resulting in a pretty well-scaled muscle protein synthesis response to your amount of protein consumed. So that's this really important study that recently came out that kind of clarifies the disconnect between the short-term studies, the shorter-term studies, 2 to 6 hours, and the long-term studies that tell us two different things. If you were to look at the muscle protein synthesis data that was done prior to this study, it's all kind of promoting this idea of, don't take any more than 20, 30 grams of protein at a time, or it gets oxidized and not used. It's not significantly different from taking, 40, 50 grams. So it's an inefficient use. So therefore, spread it out every 3 hours. We have this what's called a refractory period where you can't stimulate muscle protein synthesis again, yada, 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 yada. But then we look at all the applied studies, and whether people are consuming 3 or 6 meals per day doesn't seem to be different impact on hypertrophy if training is the same, energy balance is the same, and protein intake for the day is similar. So what's going on here? Well, it is probably what Tromelin just discovered. And there are probably some limits to this. You can't just probably have like 200-gram bolus of protein in a single day. And an interesting thing that Tromelin and colleagues did is they had a pilot testing session of just a barbecue. And they and they saw what do people, if they just go to a barbecue and eat mostly meat, or they have a meat-heavy dinner, how much they eat. And about 100 grams is what they would comfortably eat in one meal, which is why they chose that amount to try to give some, validity to this comparison. And when you look at the real world and you look at some of these studies, there are hints that you can go too low in terms of meal frequency and protein servings, or that going too long with fasting can be potentially a negative for optimizing body composition. Not huge differences, but small differences. So there was a study that was done where they looked at, I believe it was by Morrow and colleagues, and I think Tinsley might have been part of one of these, but there was a study they did that was for a 8 to 12 week period looking at time restricted feeding with an 8-hour feeding window, and positive outcomes not significantly different to a traditional feeding pattern in that 8 to 12 week period. But then they did a follow-up where individuals from that study could continue on long term. And after a full year, we actually did start to see that the traditional feeding pattern did better in terms of body composition. So this is indicating that, okay, if you're only getting in basically 2 meals per day, which is kind of what you're going to shake out to with an 8-hour feeding window, that it might be a little poorer than eating more than that. Only eating 1/3 of the day might be too low of a meal frequency or too crammed together to get the best out of that protein feeding. And there's also another study where they looked, I believe it was at athletes it might be Dutch athletes, I'm not 100% sure. I could just be thinking that because of Tromelin, but they compared 2 different meal distributions. So as you and I probably know, working as personal trainers and just having people in our lives who are not bodybuilders, the typical distribution of protein is heavily skewed towards dinner, right? You go to a steakhouse and you're getting a 60 to 70 gram protein steak, and you also have potato on the side and broccoli, and you're probably having like an 80 gram, for a typically sized male, bolus of protein. And then at lunch, it's a sandwich with maybe 10 grams. And then breakfast, at best, you got 2 eggs. And if you have pancakes, then, So you're looking at 1/3 of your dinner's intake spread into both your lunch and your breakfast. But that's really not what we think is ideal based upon that protein bolus feeding research. So there has been some comparisons where they actually look at these different distribution. And it does indicate that protein distribution matters to an extent. So there's a study by Yasuda and colleagues, and they compared 3 meals where in these young men, one group basically had more added to lunch and breakfast and less at dinner, and the other group had the normal distribution. And there were, I would say, potentially meaningful but non-significant differences favoring the group that had a more even protein distribution. So when you kind of look at the protein distribution applied research, you look at some of the studies where on intermittent fasting, you look at the acute stuff on muscle protein synthesis, and you look at this more recent study on muscle protein synthesis, you kind of start to see, hold on, it seems like you want to be having at least, the kind of intakes we talked about previously, 0.7 gram per pound or 1.6 grams per kg per day. And you probably want to optimize things, you probably want to have at least 3 boluses per day. And it's not to say that everything falls apart when you only have 2 feedings per day, but it is slightly worse probably than having 3 based upon the best evidence we have. So for protein distribution, I think it just makes sense to make sure you're eating at least 3 meals per day, consuming enough, and then it's not a bad idea to see the post-workout period as a potential opportunity to get protein in. So it's pretty easy to hit those targets for most people. And then if you really want to leverage, I'm going to try to optimize everything I possibly can, and you put maybe a little optimistic hope into the protein distribution research, you could say, I'm going to get 4 evenly spread doses of protein, just taking my current daily protein target and breaking it up and making sure that one of them is within a couple hours of my training. And I'm probably maximizing every possible applied and theoretical, distinction we could have for what could potentially be beneficial for hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on bedtime nutrition lightly. What are your thoughts on people in terms of having protein before bed, and also just meals before bed in general? You'll hear some people talking about how eating before bed interrupts their sleep, whereas for some other people, they might be worried that they won't be able to sleep if they're hungry.
Yeah. So Some people do struggle with sleep during contest prep and during diets. From what I've noticed, it seems to have more to do with the total daily energy intake, how long they've been at a deficit and how lean they are, rather than what did they just eat before bed. I do think if you actually feel hungry going to sleep, that can sometimes be a problem. But sometimes just kind of the general feeling of contest prep is like a low level grade of I could eat more. And that's probably the majority of the experience until the very end, right? And I don't think eating a large amount of calories before bed or saving one meal for an hour before bed is typically fixing that. You might find that if you have a diet break or a double day refeed, your sleep gets a little bit better. But eventually I find most people who have sleep troubles during dieting, they get to a certain point in prep and it's just there, unfortunately. And you just do your best you can to try to up your sleep hygiene and think about ways to, maybe diet on as high of calories as you can, closing the deficit as you get leaner and leaner, I think is a good approach. And it is the minority of people who I've seen successfully manipulate their distribution of calories and timing of meals relative to bedtime to where it actually helps them. Unfortunately, I wish it was something that was a little easier to manipulate, but I haven't seen that be the case. And I'm someone who personally has manipulated this and tried it because I struggle with sleep during contest prep at a certain stage. So if you look at the data on this, high calorie, high fat, high carbohydrate meals on average tend to reduce sleep quality or sleep quantity at night. And that is one area of research. And then there's also the area of research that looks at protein boluses before bed, like having casein or slow digesting protein before bed. And those have not shown a benefit when you are consuming a sufficient amount of protein and getting at least 3 servings per day. So it kind of goes back to that same rationale of why protein distribution in general doesn't really pan out the way we wish it did. Is it the appearance of amino acids in the blood is tied to digestion rate. Digestion rate is tied to the amount of protein you eat at one time, and muscle protein synthesis is going to be dependent upon how quickly amino acids appear in the blood. So if you eat fewer meals with higher protein boluses, it's going to take longer to digest. If you eat more meals with lower protein boluses, it's going to take shorter time to digest, but you're going to be having them more frequently, kind of getting to the same point with some bounding of basically saying, hey, let me have 3 meals per day. And I would say you want to have more than an 8-hour feeding window based upon some of the TRF data. So I would probably be, once you're getting above 8-hour feeding window, like if you're at a 10-hour feeding window, it's not even really, it's normal, right? That could be a 9 a.m. breakfast, 7 p.m. dinner, and then that's the last time you eat. Like no one would be like, oh, that's a weird diet. That's just kind of how most people do it. Or you can, have it be a larger time window, and then you also have a Greek yogurt a couple hours later before you go to bed. But I don't think you should expect anything to really happen from that if it's getting you to the same protein intake as you otherwise would have.
Yeah, that's what I love about this bodybuilding nutrition research is that it's not that hard to be basically optimal, right? Where everyone's like, oh my God, you're a bodybuilder. What do you do? And I'm like, I'm bulking. I'm just a normal person right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess this is more of a bulking question as well, but you mentioned about high calorie meals before bed interrupting sleep quality. What size of meal are we talking?
Like actually a full meal. Like if you were to eat something that is like a dinner before bed. I don't think it's something people should really worry about while dieting, but definitely, like you said, when bulking, you probably want to start curtailing your energy intake a bit later in the day. And if you do have, and the thing is, it hasn't been shown and to be related to protein intake. So I wouldn't worry about like having Greek yogurt before bed or a protein shake or something like that. So like if you have a 9 p.m. 200 calorie, 300 calorie serving of mostly protein, I don't think that would likely have any negative impact on sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. And then one other more advanced topic when it comes to fat loss is refeeds. This was a big sort of debate a few years ago. What are your current thoughts?
Yeah, so the data we generally have on intermittent energy restriction is neutral to positive. Is a kind of a good way to frame it. The thing we still have not studied yet, which I'm quite interested in, is using refeeds and or diet breaks in the presence of metabolic adaptation and seeing if it helps. The studies that have been done out of Bill Campbell's lab on a 2-day refeed, the studies that were previously done in individuals with obesity, and the studies that were done by Pios and also Seidler, coming out of Campbell's lab and others, all of them, even when they're done in athletic individuals who are dieting to go from kind of a normal to a lean body composition, there was very minor metabolic adaptation when you look at changes in RMR and very minor shifts physiologically. So it's kind of the idea of we can't really empirically test how effectively a refeed or a diet break can mitigate metabolic adaptation if there's nothing to mitigate, if there's not metabolic adaptation occurring, right? So right now, we have data indicating that both that diet breaks, which, taking basically a week at maintenance, have consistently resulted in from 2 different labs, better hunger management through different scales. So decreased disinhibition, which is kind of like the drive to overeat, or higher satiety, or general just better feelings of mood. And also during a diet break, you see slightly better, I think, muscular endurance was shown in one of Pios' study that I was a part of. So there are some positive effects, but they largely seem related to potentially enhancing adherence or like hunger levels, hunger management. And I think that's where I have the most faith right now, is that these intermittent dieting strategies could be useful for mitigating hunger or extreme appetite, and you can kind of cyclically include them as a way to boost adherence and make the process not feel as hard. And I am cautiously optimistic, given the anecdotal experiences that contest prep competitors have, that they could be helpful when you're in the deeper state of prep, that they might actually be helpful for maybe not making a big difference on energy expenditure, but potentially helping with lean mass retention or performance, or mitigating lethargy, boosting NEAT a little bit to where they might be better than not including them. But we don't have good empirical data in the right state to show that. It is another way to prevent the energy deficit cumulatively for being too low. But you could also just diet longer and have a lower energy deficit on a day-to-day basis and probably get to a very similar place. Anecdotally, I can say that some people seem to respond very well to refeeds and diet breaks. And in the specific goal of contest preparation, where you're trying to get extremely lean, the barrier to people getting really, really lean is generally how much ability do they have to apply effort in a pretty compromised physiological state. How much have you preserved yourself when you get to this phase where you're below your lower intervention point in terms of body fat? You've experienced energy compensation from all the cardio you're doing. You've experienced metabolic adaptation. You're experiencing red S. You just feel pretty rough, and you're like, damn, I still have to lose 5 pounds if I want to get shredded. Where do you get that willpower reserve from? Well, if you've crushed yourself the whole way to get there and you're super, super hungry, you may not have it, or it will come at a significant cost some other way. Something else will give. But if you have been able to preserve your energy levels and manage your hunger a little better through an intermittent dieting strategy, and you have kind of picked your spots, if you will, and your experience of the diet is that it's been a little bit easier by the time you get to that point, you have that willpower reserve, even though physiologically it may not have gotten you leaner. It may have even taken longer because you're taking these diet breaks or refeeds, but you can actually get to the end point you want. And that has been, I think that is at the very least what could explain the anecdotes that I see of benefits from using refeeds and diet breaks, if not also there being some beneficial physiological effect that we would only see in people who are quite lean or have been dieting quite a while and are experiencing changes in their physiology that downregulates energy expenditure.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky thing about these kinds of more advanced intervention, is that you're never going to have a study of a bunch of contest prep bodybuilders who are going to allow you to control what they're doing, especially in the weeks leading up to the show.
Yeah, at best we might have what's called a quasi-experimental design, where you take a really similar homogeneous group of people, contest prep competitors, and you ask them about the approach they took during contest prep, and you a priori decide on what is the definition of someone who used refeeds or diet breaks. And then you compare in a sufficient enough sample size outcomes in terms of body composition testing at a certain finish. So you do your own thing, And if it fell into these rough, categories, then we'll only include, a certain number of people in each group so we can get matched total energy intake, similar baseline demographics. So those aren't significantly different at baseline. So you're doing your best to control for some of those factors, then you compare them. Now, that is not as good as a randomized controlled trial because you don't have randomized allocation. There might be some reason people are choosing to do that might actually be the explanatory factor, but it's probably as close as we'll get. Another similar study in terms of design was a study that compared those bodybuilders who carbohydrate loaded versus those who did not by Dave Moraes and colleagues. And they just had a cutoff in terms of the grams per kilogram of carbohydrate consumed in the final week for those who did a carb load or didn't. And they looked at whether their physique silhouettes looked more muscular, and whether or not they had fewer or less gastrointestinal distress symptoms, and there was changes in their muscle thicknesses, circumferences, and fat thickness measurements. And in that quasi-experimental design, it looked like carbohydrate loading was a benefit to making them appear more muscular. So that's decently strong evidence, but we can't know for sure because we didn't randomly assign them to those interventions, whether it is, the actual causational factor. But it is a stronger research design than just observations or anecdotes for sure. So I could see us eventually getting to something like that, or maybe being able to do like a multi-site data collection over a longer time period where a few bodybuilders let us mess with their diets. But yeah, there is some research on this that is experimental. There was one that was done recently that looked at calories consumed during an ad libitum cheat meal as a part of a refeed in the first 4 weeks of a contest prep. And they were looking at what personality factors led people to eat more or less in these cheat meals. So it is possible, that was also more of a, observational design. But those bodybuilders let the researchers go, hey, here's how we're going to use this 2-day refeed strategy for the first 4 weeks of prep. But it was, again, first 4 weeks of prep. And it was a relatively, minor change in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, we're going to be limited, but it doesn't mean that we can't still make some helpful inferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm personally a pretty big supporter of using refeeds and prep, and largely because of the social flexibility element where you're able to maintain your relationships, and a lot of our culture revolves around food, so you're able to, go to family events or go hang out with your significant other. Two sort of interesting applications I've thought of is that when you have a sort of non-linear dieting approach, you can program in tougher workouts on your refeed days if you have an asymmetric workout program, for example, leg days. Another thought I've had is that you can catch up on sleep if you have a refeed and you find that you recover better. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know. I generally agree that the flexibility afforded by including refeeds and diet breaks, I think is probably the most important thing. From a coaching perspective, just being like, hey, like it's tough to say, like, okay, if we had a smaller deficit and we didn't have refeeds, would your sleep be as negatively impacted on those low days versus not? Exactly. My experience is that, a low or a lower day both kind of suck, and they both kind of produce a similar level of, like it doesn't take much. Like if you think about the calorie difference between having a 1 or 2 day refeed versus, 5 low days, 6 low days, or 7 low days, it's 102 to 200 calories on most days. So whether you're in a 300 calorie deficit or a 400 calorie deficit, is that going to have a marked enough difference in sleep versus having a day at maintenance? Hard to say. I think anecdotally it does. I've seen the same thing, that refeeds do allow people to like have some normal bowel movements, be able to sleep, have some normal social meals, engage with their loved ones in kind of a normal life, and then that can really help them feel less quote unquote diet fatigue from the process. So I tend to agree, and I think that is it's at least a tool you want to have in your tool belt. But I think there are also some athletes who really struggle with keeping the mentality of still being on the plan when they have refeeds.
Yeah.
And when those refeeds turn into kind of like binge days, that's when you really want to be mindful and have a conversation with them. Like, how are you thinking about this? Because they might still be struggling with that kind of all in, all off kind of black and white mentality. And that's not a good fit. You still have to have a little bit of restraint on refeed days. And I think if an athlete can't do that, that's obviously a like a problem, and that's a coaching point. But you also don't want to make the situation worse by continually providing them that challenge when they haven't yet shifted their mindset away from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for some people, it's almost like, abstinence from smoking or something like that, where once they get started, it can almost trigger them to eat more.
Yeah, and I like I said, that to me that's a coaching point. That's a bigger issue, that they are very much have an on or off the diet mentality. That's a problem in of itself, where we're going to see an issue with maintenance of behavior and maintenance of in a non-competitive sense. That's a red flag for someone who's probably going to regain their weight.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not just it's fine, but we just won't use refeeds with this person. It's like, okay, we shouldn't use refeeds with this person, but we should really work on that mentality. So just to put that out there.
Yeah, no, that's a really wise point in terms of not just seeing contest prep as, hey, I'm helping this person for these next 16 weeks and then goodbye, but like it's actually helping them in terms of their overall fitness career, right? And it goes a lot deeper than just getting on stage for a day.
Absolutely.
When you're running a diet, how do you make adjustments to macros? How do you know when to drop things, and what kind of drops will you make?
I generally think the best approach is to set a minimum intake for fats, carbs, and protein, and then have a calorie target. So I don't normally tell people to drop carbs, drop fat, or drop protein. I just adjust the calorie target while still having those minimums in place. And then that allows the person to adjust their nutrition in a way that gives them more flexibility and adjusting to their lives. I don't think you can make a strong case for why it would be better to drop 10 grams of fat or 25 grams of carbohydrate, or 20 grams of fat or 45 grams of carbohydrate, these kind of roughly isocaloric exchanges. So yeah, I think that's the approach that I would recommend most people think about, is what's a minimum appropriate intake of protein, a minimum appropriate intake of fat, a minimum appropriate intake of carbohydrate, and then how do I make sure I'm still getting in those fiber, fruit and vegetable recommendations, and roughly following the guideline of having no restriction on processed foods, but largely having an unprocessed diet, and then just changing your energy intake, or adjusting step count up or doing more cardio, knowing that might not be a one-to-one improvement because of energy compensation. So yeah, I think a generally good range of how much should you drop calories when you've stalled is depending upon the size of the energy intake, somewhere between 100 to 200 calories. Like a 200 calorie drop's totally fine if you're eating 2,500 calories plus, but you probably want to be closer to 100 if you're a smaller person dieting on 1,600 calories, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds good. Well, that wraps up a great discussion on fat loss. Just touching in on how things are going, and a little update from Eric. How's bulking been going for you?
It was surprisingly well, to be honest. I've gained a lot more weight than we initially intended. And a unique kind of cool thing is that when a diet in the off season is going really well, when a surplus is going really well, if you're gaining predominantly lean mass, you're going to see a faster weight gain than would be predicted, because there's far fewer calories in muscle than there are in the same weight of fat tissue, because adipose tissue is only 10 to 20% water, and the part of it that is fat is 9 calories per gram, just like the dietary fat we eat, while muscle is predominantly water, and then the component that is actual contractile tissue is only 4 calories per gram, right? So I have, despite a relatively moderate energy intake of 25 to 2,800 calories per day, I'm 10% over stage weight in May now from November, and I was anticipating we'd get here in November, so a year after. So, but my body comp is quite lean still, and I look much visibly larger. I've improved really well in the gym. And in my last check-in with Brian Miner, who's doing my off-season coaching, which you guys can check out on the Team 3DMJ YouTube channel, it's episode 10 of Believe 2024, we decided, hey, let's push the body weight up further than 88 than we initially decided in terms of kilos, all the way up to 92. So that's the goal, is to get up to, and it's about a little over 200 pounds, 92 kilograms by November, instead of where I'm already at 7 months early, or 6 months early. So it's going good.
Doing too well. That's
right.
Doing too well.
That's right. Too well.
Okay. Hot take. in terms of the weight that you gained, what proportion of that do you think is lean mass?
Well, I've definitely increased body fat because I mean, we have to think about where was I? I was 79.5 at Worlds. Like that was my kind of average weight the week of Worlds. And that was me shredded, you know. So I have put on probably a solid like 50% of this weight as body fat, I would guess. And then, okay, so if I put on, you know, basically 10 kilos, 22 pounds, 11 pounds of fat, 11 pounds of muscle. How much of that is new muscle? That's another question too, because there's probably invariably some lean mass loss. And some of that lean mass loss is probably muscle loss. So I wouldn't be surprised if I haven't put on like 4 or 5 pounds of muscle, which is pretty amazing to me.
Sick.
It's kind of mind blowing, to be honest. So
yeah, that's wild. Great. So some big things are coming down the pipe. # Believe 2024.
That's right.
Follow
Big
Eric's
things coming as in
on YouTube.
Me. I'm huge. No, we're doing good, man. I'm really motivated, and it's exciting to be fully focused on the bodybuilding.
Yeah, so really excited to be following Eric's journey, and I'm sure we'll have him on again soon to talk about how this is the whole Believe 2024 process is going. Where can people find you, Eric?
3dmusclejourney.com, best place to go. That is the number 3, the letter D, and then Muscle Journey typed out. And from there, you can find links to the research review Mass, where I cover all this type of stuff on a monthly basis with my colleagues. Links to my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, where we go through this whole hierarchy of importance. And then, of course, if you want to work with us one-on-one, kind of like I'm doing with Brian Miner, then we have coaching available. And then if you want to catch me on awesome podcasts like this, follow me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Great. I'll link Eric in the description below. And thanks for being on the show.
It's a pleasure, man. Thank you for having me.